We have a variety of news to discuss tonight, including some coaching contract extensions that might be happening soon, update on when the draft lottery might be taking place, as well as the Seattle Kraken. Some big names might be made available via trade to Seattle before the expansion draft. We'll discuss that coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have a variety of things to talk about here today. Before we jump into the news regarding the Seattle Kraken and some potential trades we might see ahead of the expansion draft, we have a few other notable news items to discuss here quickly. First, the NHL draft lottery is looking like it's going to take place on July the 2nd. Now, normally that takes place usually early in either the first round or near the end of the first round of the playoffs. So obviously the playoffs right now are looking to start, mid to late May here. Obviously with the NHL schedule getting close to being finalized, the playoffs will be starting in a few weeks' time. So it's going to be a little bit later than usual, but that's what they're aiming for right now is July 2nd for the draft lottery. Now, there's also some on the NHL Board of Governors, so the owners basically, and in some cases GMs, obviously are concerned about playoffs as well, that if there's a COVID outbreak during the playoffs, they might have to forfeit the playoff series. So that's another thing that I'm not sure that when the NHL will actually reveal what its protocols are going to be. But should a team run into an issue and they can't play, it's not like you can just rejig the schedule and have the team that you're supposed to play somebody else and all that like you can in a regular season. I think they would have to maybe take a couple of days and assess the situation. And if the team's going to be out for too long, they may not have any choice but to forfeit. So that could be an unfortunate way for a team's season to end. Hopefully we don't run into that here as we get closer to the playoffs. I know on the U.S. side of things, I know a lot of the teams have been vaccinated, or at least mostly, so hopefully we can avoid seeing anything like that. Now, when it comes to some contracts, I want to take a look at some updates concerning some coaches and a GM working towards contract extensions with their existing clubs. First up, the New Jersey Devils are getting closer apparently to extending GM Tom Fitzgerald. Tom Fitzgerald has been the GM now for some time. He started off on an interim basis. He already had a contract with the organization when he first took over, and they are discussing extending him. So I think for the most part, he's done a pretty good job with what he's had to work with so far, and they're building around a lot of their younger players. So they're going to be a few years, in my opinion, before they can really be competitive. He certainly has a lot of work to do, and they seem to be content to stick with him here for the somewhat foreseeable future, at least a few more years. Now, when it comes to NHL coaches, there's a few that we're wondering if they're going to get extended, and there is word that, for example, with Canes coach Rod Brind'Amour, that the Hurricanes are getting close to making an extension happen. Apparently, it's been really challenging to get this done. I think a lot of that probably has to do with owner Tom Dundon. I mean, not to say that he's necessarily being cheap or anything like that, but I know when it comes to the players, he's been pretty good with contracts, but I know he is of the belief that there are other members of the organization, like coaches and managers and everybody else, really shouldn't make as much as what they do. So it's been a tough negotiation for Rod Brind'Amour, but he's a well-respected guy in the organization. It's hard to imagine him coaching anywhere else. But you know what? He's had a lot of success too and deserves a good raise. And I'm sure he's looking for some, comparable contracts here, looking at some other guys that have had success too. So they are apparently getting closer, and many do believe he will end up staying. But as I mentioned before, if things don't materialize there, I would think his old friend Ron Francis and the Kraken will be certainly talking to him about a role with their organization if things don't work out. Now, another coach that's getting at least a little bit closer, or talks are expected to get more serious here in the very near future, is Vancouver Canucks coach Travis Green. Now, it's hard to imagine why he's not signed yet. I know it's been believed all along that the Canucks intend to keep him around, but there really hasn't been a whole lot going on. I know they've had a lot of other issues this year. The Canucks are having a down season. There's certainly a lot of other external factors here that, not necessarily his fault per se. So I think the Canucks will look to extend Travis Green, but I certainly am not sure that one is such a slam dunk as the Rod Brind'Amour one. I think the odds of Brind'Amour getting his contract down, I think, are much greater. But according to Elliot Friedman, his sources indicate that the Canucks intend to get serious with Green here in the very short term. There's also reports too that former NHLer Dimitry Yaskin is looking to make an NHL return. He's been over in the KHL for the past couple of seasons. And apparently there's a rumor that the Arizona Coyotes are potentially interested in bringing him back and are looking to possibly offer him a 2-year contract. So Yaskin, one of many players we've seen leave for the KHL, looking to make that return, and there is interest. So we'll see if that pans out for him to get him back and get a contract with Arizona. Now, as I mentioned, some interesting topics I thought we would talk about tonight is some rumors have come across about some players that could possibly find themselves as members of the Seattle Kraken, and it may not necessarily be through the expansion draft. There could be some trades. We know that last time the NHL expanded with the Vegas Golden Knights, that there was a lot of deals being cut off to the side here. Some players were basically traded or given to Vegas in exchange for other players not being selected at the expansion draft, or draft picks were swapped and different things like that. And I don't expect to be quite as much this time as there was with Vegas. I think a lot of teams learned their lesson that they really didn't do well. Obviously you got to be really careful with those types of deals. I mean, some of those players they gave up for nothing turned out to be really solid players for Vegas once they had more of an opportunity and a chance to play a bigger role. And some of the guys they really fought hard to protect didn't necessarily pan out long term either. So it's a really, you might as well just say, listen, we know we're losing a decent player. Let's just protect who we think we're going to want to keep here more than anybody else, and we lose who we lose and just deal with it from there. But teams aren't going to do that. For example, let's start with the Tampa Bay Lightning. They're one of the more interesting teams to watch as the season ends and it gets closer to the expansion draft. I mean, they're a loaded team. They have a very deep team, which means there's bound to be some good-looking talent to the Kraken available there. Now, for example, some feel that the Lightning are more likely to go with an 8-skater protection instead of the 7-3-1 approach. Now, if they go with the 7-3-1 approach, then obviously there's going to be a decent defenseman available for sure. If they go with the 8 skaters approach, they can certainly protect more of the blue line. That would allow them to protect Hedman, McDonough, Sergachev, and Cernak, which obviously is important. If not, I would think Chernak's probably the one that doesn't get protected if they go 7-3-1. But at the same time, if they do that, that means there's also going to be more in the forward group that's available. I know a player that they would like to move on from, but had a very difficult time, is Tyler Johnson. They put him through waivers. They tried to trade him. He wasn't really too cooperative with what he was willing to do to waive a no-move clause. Obviously, that's his right to do so, of course. So you can't really complain about that. They gave it to him, and now they have to deal with it. But many feel that Johnson would be a type of player that they would try to move to Seattle and might have to sweeten that deal. Tyler Johnson still has 3 years left with a $5 million cap hit, but he's from that area. He might be interested in going to the Kraken, be a chance for him to play at home. It's something a lot of players like to do if given a chance, especially being a brand new franchise. He could be, a veteran leader on that team, and it might be something he's willing to entertain. So if the Kraken are willing to take Johnson, the Lightning are going to have to sweeten that deal. There's no way they're going to say, sure, we'll take him. No problem. They're going to say, offer us a first-round pick and a prospect or something like that, and then that maybe would be how they would do it. They could either do it that they work out a trade for Johnson and obviously work it out that way, or they could say, you make us a trade that's really lopsided, like give us a first-round pick and a prospect for like a 7th or something like that, and then in return we'll take Johnson in the expansion draft. Either way, there'd be some type of deal cut. That is a possibility. Of course, that does require Seattle to be in agreement to take him, though. That not something at this point we can guarantee, because if they go the other way here and they don't do that deal, then obviously they're going to have some other options available. If they go the 8 skaters approach, you would think that guys like Kucherov, Stamkos, Point, and Cirelli would be the main 4 forwards protected, which is going to open up some other interesting names like an Alex Killorn, for example, would be available, a Blake Coleman, a Pat Maroon. There's other guys there that they would probably like to keep, but would certainly be at risk of losing. So they might have to go with that route instead. Maybe the Kraken really like Blake Coleman, for example. I mean, he's, get a decent contract. He's a guy that can play, a good penalty killing role, be a good probably third line player for them. Maybe a higher role for them, depending on who else they have on the roster. That might be the way they go. So the Lightning are in a team that's a prime example that there's just no way around it. They're going to lose a decent player, but of course they would like to have a preference on who they lose, being Tyler Johnson. Maybe the hometown kid can end up being back in Seattle if they're willing to pay a nice price here to sweeten that offer. So it wouldn't be surprising to see Johnson traded to Seattle by throwing in a first-round pick and a nice prospect in there as well. So we'll see what the Lightning do, but they're certainly going to be one of the interesting teams to watch ahead of the expansion draft. Now, of course, their state rivals, the Florida Panthers, in my opinion, are another team to watch. They have a pretty good goaltending conundrum on their hands. They obviously have Chris Driedger, who's a pending UFA. Some thought they might trade him at the deadline because they know they're likely losing him for nothing at the end of the year. However, then that would really weaken them for the playoffs. So they obviously are confident in what their group can offer here in a potential playoff run, and that wouldn't make sense to do that. However, are they going to lose them for nothing this summer? Well, that's a real possibility that could happen, but they could end up signing him to send him to Seattle because obviously they get Sergei Bobrovsky and making $10 million on a long-term deal. Seattle's not taking Bobrovsky off their hands, even if they wanted them to. I don't think there's any way they could sweeten that deal to make it happen. So Bobrovsky's not going anywhere. As they have Spencer Knight, who they just signed out of college, who's played a little bit as well and has looked good. So they certainly are likely intend to run with Bobrovsky and Knight as their goaltending tandem next year. So Driedger's a guy who's a pending UFA. They could lose him for nothing. But if Driedger is in agreement with it, because obviously he's a pending unrestricted free agent, he'd have to play ball here as well because he'd have to have some reassurances that everything would go down the way they said it would. But they could sign him just to expose him to Seattle and have him taken so that they don't lose something else off their roster. That's a possibility that we could see. Obviously, the Florida Panthers have a pretty good-looking roster there. Instead of losing another forward or defenseman that they would prefer to keep, they could maybe sign Driedger just for exposure purposes and just leave him at that. They could protect Bobrovsky. Knight's exempt. Driedger gets signed. He meets the requirement. I mean, they do have Samuel Montembeault. They don't have to sign Driedger here because they do already have enough in the system to meet the requirements. But it could be a case that they sign him for Seattle to get him there, or maybe they work out a trade as well. That's a possibility too. So either way, I mean, Chris Driedger is bound to get himself a good contract, and that's the only thing is they'd have to have something worked out here with Seattle ahead of time to make it happen clearly, because if they sign Driedger and then they don't get that deal done, then they're going to be screwed salary cap wise to have all that goaltending money tied up. And then once that happens, teams are not going to be too eager to help them out. As much as they might want Driedger, they're not going to just take him off their hands for nothing. They're going to obviously need something going back the other way, and it could get complicated for them. So clearly they could make a deal with this Kraken, like I said, either trade or have him sign for exposure purposes, depending on what they want to do there, so that they don't lose something else, because they're not going to have Chris Driedger next year anyway. So why not use that to your advantage to not lose something additional? Now, lastly here, we want to take a look at the San Jose Sharks. And there's a recent article here from The Athletic that I was looking at, doing some Seattle mock drafts like I've been doing. And even though I've toyed with the idea before, I kind of wondered, they feel that there's a decent chance the Sharks would make Brent Burns available and that he could end up in Seattle. Now, that could also be a situation where the Kraken kind of exploit San Jose's preference here for them to take Burns and to get something else out of them as well. So there could be another side trade to help some additional assets there. Now, I'm not sure what they would want from San Jose. Might have to get something, in terms of picks or prospect, which they don't have a ton of. So they do have a decent amount of picks, I guess, but prospect-wise, I'm not sure what they would end up giving up. But obviously, Brent Burns is still a guy who can play. He's a little bit older, and he still has a fair bit of term on his contract. So for Seattle to take that on, I mean, Brent Burns has had a great career, but it's they're going to have to be an incentive for Seattle to do that. I'm sure that a lot of them are involved with the Kraken organization. Are probably fond of Brent Burns as a player if you look at his whole body of work, his whole career. But it really boils down to, do you really want that contract? I do see them taking probably a couple of maybe more expensive contracts. They can't take too many to make sure they have cap flexibility. They don't want to be tied to the cap here right off the bat. Obviously, that wouldn't be good. They would be very limited on how they can improve their team over the first year or two, which is clearly not something they want. But when it comes to Brent Burns, it's a tempting thing. I mean, if they can make it a good enough offer for them, you have to think that would be something that they would consider. I mean, the San Jose Sharks are a team that are clearly needing to rebuild, in my opinion. We've seen guys like Thornton move on. Marlowe, of course, has left and he came back. There's a chance he could continue to stay, really, but they do need some vets to stick around, but they have more than enough is the problem. They still have Logan Couture. They still have Evander Kane in the forward group. They've got Meyer and Hurdle on the blue line now. Besides Burns, they've got that Carlson contract, the Vlasic contract. I don't think the Sharks would be completely opposed to losing one of those big contracts on the back end, and you know they're not going to want to lose it for nothing. And obviously, like, out of all those contracts, Burns might be the one that is easiest to move, to be honest. I mean, he's got the shortest amount of term left between all three, and it's still one of the better, probably the best when it comes to productivity still at this point. I mean, Carlson's kind of had his moments this year, but still, like, I don't know if I'd be wanting that contract. There's too much term and money left. So we'll see what happens, but those are some three interesting teams to watch that are likely going to be making deals with the Kraken ahead of the expansion draft that could involve some pretty interesting names and veteran players ending up to be a part of the inaugural Seattle Kraken roster. So let me know your thoughts on those potential deals down in the comments, and we'll discuss further. And I'm sure we'll discuss those scenarios further the next time we do a Seattle Mock Expansion Draft, which we'll likely be doing here sometime right after the regular season comes to an end and we see a little bit more player movement. So let me know your thoughts and we'll discuss in the comments. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and stick around. We'll keep you up to date with all the latest news from around all 31 NHL teams. Thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time.